To show you how important these 5 things are, I want to tell you a story. Alright, imagine you have 2 guys that want to learn Blender. One's name is Kyle and the other one's name is Van Gogh. The only difference is Van Gogh has been studying art for the past 10 years. Now let's take a look at what they rendered their first 2 weeks using Blender. For the first example, we have Kyle's rendered image on the bottom and Van Gogh's rendered image on the top. Now which one do you think looks better? If you say the top image was better, why is that? Well, that comes to our first 2 important things that you need to know. The first thing that you need to know is color theory. One part of color theory that is really important to Blender artists is knowing exactly what colors go well together. Let's look at Kyle's image first. Kyle chose to use red, purple, and green together. Now in color theory, these colors are not ideal for artists to use together in an image. However, Van Gogh chose to use blue, an orangish tan, and a light pink color. Colors that in theory look better together. So it's really important to know color theory even though you won't be mixing your own colors together. Now that brings us to our second concept that you need to know, and that's composition. Composition is the way you set your objects in your scene. Now let's look at Kyle's placement of his little monster in the scene. He set his in the top left of the image and doesn't really have a flow or style to it. But if you look at Van Gogh's image, he uses style in composition theory called the rule of thirds, where he sets his objects in a scene based on splitting the image into thirds. There are many different ways you can place your objects in a scene, but I would highly recommend you take some time to learn composition to make your renders better. Now imagine a wealthy client came up to Kyle and Van Gogh with an image of his driveway and told him that he's thinking about buying a luxury sports car, but before he makes his purchase, he wants to see what the car looks like in his driveway. So Kyle and Van Gogh both use Blender to place the car in the scene. Let's take a look at their renders. Here we have Kyle, and it looks a bit off, but Van Gogh's image looks like the car belongs in the scene. Now why is this? Well, this is the third concept you should know, and that's called perspective. Perspective is the art of drawing 3D objects in 2D space. Well, I know you're saying I'm a 3D artist, I don't need to know how to draw 3D objects on paper. Well, I would say you don't need to know how to draw every 3D object on paper, but you do need to know how to draw the default cube on paper. This will get you familiar with 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective, as well as what vanishing points are. It's important to know these things, so if you need to place a 3D object on a 2D image, you'll know how. Finally, let's have a look at Van Gogh's and Kyle's last images they rendered. Kyle's is on the left and Van Gogh's is on the right. Now what 2 things do you see wrong? Well, for starters, Kyle's made the feet on his model too big, and the arms on the model too long. This is called proportion and is another concept you need to learn to make better renders. Proportion is how big something is related to another object. Now, proportions aren't just for body parts. You can have proportions of a certain car, a boat, or even a couch. It's all relative, but if you don't know how to relate sizes to each other, your images will always look weird. And the last concept that you need to learn if you're making character models is anatomy and gesture. Do you see how Van Gogh's image of the model has her hand on her hip and is standing slightly sideways? And Kyle's is stiff and boring? Now this is called gesture, and it's a concept that, if learned, can help your images stand out from the rest. And of course you'll need to know some anatomy for sculpting characters. You don't need to know the name of every body part, but if you're studying to become a character designer, you'll need to study the body to create the structures needed for a base of your character. If you want to learn more about each topic in depth, check out the links in the description below. Thanks for watching.